All right, welcome to another edition of the PXPU podcast, where every Thursday we talk to someone who's got the knowledge, the experience, the wisdom, and the education that you need in order to be the best you can while calling the sports that you love. I'm Tony Castricone. I'm the voice of the Huskies, and this podcast is part of Play by Play University, where we're trying to create the best, most insightful, instructive, helpful content on the internet for people who want to be a play by play announcer, or a sideline reporter, or a studio host or even a color analyst. And so let's talk some baseball today. Baseball season, pitchers and catchers have reported. It is right around the corner, and Cory Provus has been doing baseball for decades. I mean, this guy's really good, and you'll learn a lot from him. So, Cory, thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
You got it,
And
man. It was nice meeting you at the barn a couple weeks ago.
yeah, yeah. I assume baseball weather in Minnesota has not quite gotten there yet.
No, it is it is about 3 degrees outside right now. The snowfall this winter is a little better than last year. We average in Minneapolis about 52 inches of snowfall annually, but last year I think we got like 18, but then 2 years ago we got 95. So this year we probably have, I'd say, just over 2 feet total accumulation. But look, I dig it. There's some skiing here. There's cross country skiing. There's snowshoeing. I mean, winter activity is a part of life here. So I like the seasons. I like the snowfall. So we're getting a little bit more this winter.
Hey, you know what? I wasn't really planning on asking you this, but you kind of just dove in a little bit. Where are you from originally? And Minnesota is on the extreme end weather-wise. Like, was that something that was an adjustment to you? Did you have to like get the family on board to take a job like that? Give me that whole background.
Born and raised in Maui. I'm just joking. I was not. No, I'm from the Chicagoland area.
Okay, so
I'm from Highland Park, Illinois. Just about 20 minutes or so, no traffic. So more with traffic, like an hour and a half north of the city. And so yeah, I'm from the Chicagoland area, but the weather here. I went to Syracuse, so the snowfall that we get here is nothing
yeah,
compared to what we got those 4 years in college.
yeah. So Chicago, Syracuse, Minnesota, and you're going to retire in Canada somewhere, I guess, right? Is that how that's going to go?
Saskatchewan. Don't sleep on Saskatoon now. I mean, it is lovely. It is lovely.
Yeah, I've always wanted to go to Banff, so
It's
I got to
beautiful.
check
I was
that.
there. My wife and I went. My wife and I went last summer. We spent 4 days there, and it is exactly what it looks like in all the pictures. It is awesome.
Yeah,
And we fly to Calgary, and then it's about a 90-minute drive into the park, into the state park, and it is awesome. Bucket
yeah,
list, and we scratched that one off last summer.
that sounds great. Well, I'm really glad we got a chance to cross paths recently because I've known your name forever, but I just met you in person a couple weeks ago when Washington played at Minnesota, and you were doing the TV end of that game. And the reason I've known your name forever is because I'm in my 15th year at Learfield, and you're like one of the OGs at IMG College, which merged with Learfield. But Chris Ferris told stories of you from pretty much the moment that I showed up. And you were part of a super, super unique deal where you were ground floor employee of what became one of the biggest college sports broadcasting corporations that exists. So tell me, tell me the story of how you got in there. And I just want to pick your brain about the incubator that existed to kind of flourish into what we all know as Learfield today.
So it all goes back to when I graduated from Syracuse in 2000. I had my second semester senior year. This guy by the name of Dave Pash was
Heard of
back
him?
on campus. You've heard of him before. And at the time, he was in his first year calling Syracuse football and basketball. And he was also teaching a class. And I had some elective credit that I needed to kill before I graduated. And the last thing any second semester senior wants to do is take a Friday morning 8:30 class. But sure
True.
enough, this is when Dave Pash was offering this play-by-play class, and I thought it'd be great to meet him, get to know him, and just begin to kind of start. I thought that would be really the kickstart to what I hoped would be a career in this industry. And we became good friends, and he became a great resource for me. And then, as graduation was approaching, there was an opening to call Virginia Tech women's basketball that fall. So, in the fall, winter of 2000. And Bill Roth, now back and the legendary voice of the Virginia Tech Hokies, also a Syracuse graduate, he had an opening on his staff. So he called Dave and asked Dave, he said, "Hey, anybody stand out? Any WAR guys where we all worked in college stand out?" And Dave recommended me. So that was really my first opportunity to start with ISP Sports. And that was going to be in the fall of 2000, just calling Virginia Tech women's basketball. And I wanted to do play by play. At the same time, born and raised in Chicago, I was interviewing for an update job in Chicago at one of the all sports stations, WSCR, the score. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to get this job. I mean, 21 years old, I'm not starting in, market three in the country. It's not going to happen. And I interviewed and I felt pretty good about it. And then I interviewed at Virginia Tech, and Bill needed an answer. Can you do this or not? And he gave me until Friday. And that's when I called Ron Gleason, who was the program director at the score at the time, and said, "Here's my dilemma. I've been offered a job. I will turn it down if you tell me that I have a pretty good chance of getting this job with you guys." And he told me, "No, I can't guarantee you that." And I said, "That's all I need to hear. Thank you for your time." And the best decision I made was taking a play by play job, because that's advice that I pass along to this day, and we can get to that later on. But that began my employment and partnership with ISP Sports in Blacksburg, Virginia. So just doing Virginia Tech women's basketball games, and ISP's headquarters were in Winston-Salem, which is only not even a 2-hour drive maybe from Blacksburg, if that. And there would be times I would go down and help out and get some FaceTime with not only Ben Sutton, who was the president of the company and the founder, Joe Potter, Bill Merrifield, and especially Chris Ferris, who was in charge of this ever growing idea of how college broadcasting could look in the future and could grow and expand. So it was just a one-story building, and it looked, if you were driving by, it looked like an insurance company. It didn't stand out as this broadcast center. But we would, at the time, there might have been only 4 schools, maybe 5, that were coming out of this building. And in this closet, there would be small Mackie boards with Sennheiser headsets and these dividers. And on a particular Saturday, I would be down there if Virginia Tech was on the road, because as the years went on in Blacksburg, I morphed from not just doing Virginia Tech women's basketball, but then doing Virginia Tech football pre, half, and post for Bill Roth and Mike Burnup, that I'd have to drive down and do it from Winston-Salem. So we'd be in this closet with these dividers, and Tom Hart, the Tom Hart, he would be doing updates for, I think, Southern Miss. Carter Blackburn would be doing hosting for Georgia Tech, and then there would be me. And we talked to each other. We'd be 2 feet from each other, but when we went on the air, we'd have to lean in, right? Lean in so that our voice would be blocked out a little bit with the dividers. And that just became kind of how I got my start with ISP Sports, and then a full-time job. Carter Blackburn got hired by CSTV, that was starting out this new college sports television network. He got hired to be their main play-by-play TV voice in the fall winter of 2003, and then I applied for that job and was lucky enough to get it. So that was my first full-time job, and then I moved to Winston-Salem, and then we began to shift our broadcast center from that one building. In the backyard was this small ranch house, and in the basement, all of a sudden, with cobwebs, and it looked like an old wine cellar was down there. We have all this high-tech computer equipment, and we're trying not to get, a snake bite, and we're trying not to get, a random mouse jumping on your back. trying to make sure that all the Ethernet cables are plugged in. I'm like, what is going on here? And if you were driving by, you'd have no idea what was going on in there. But as the years went on, that became, I think, 7 or 8 broadcasts originated from this small ranch house. So if you're listening to a Syracuse game, a Virginia Tech game, a Georgia Tech game, Wake, Southern Miss, Tulane, Villanova, that's where it all came from. It was coming from this nonchalant ranch house in the middle of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and it was an experience of a lifetime that I look back on. And there's no way that as my career has moved along, it doesn't happen without those important years that began first in Blacksburg and then carried over into Winston-Salem.
So for, and I don't want to make assumptions, but I know what it's like to be early 20s. And at that point, for me, I'm only focused about trying to be good enough on the air to get people's attention so that I could get like the next thing, right? And so I'm only thinking about on-air performance and that sort of deal. But the business side of it, I didn't really learn until my late 20s when I went to IMG college and kind of got around all of that. And I think that was where I started to really take a big leap because, I think the average listener might listen to themselves and be like, well, wait a second, how the heck do, do 8 colleges end up being produced out of this ranch house in Winston-Salem, North Carolina? Well, Ben Sutton started a college multimedia marketing business, started with Wake Forest, right? And he essentially bought Wake Forest football stadium a scoreboard and says in exchange, I'm going to get these multimedia and marketing assets that included the radio broadcast. He needed to hire somebody to produce the radio broadcast, so he brings on Chris Ferris, and then he makes deals at other schools, and so this thing just starts growing and blooming. And I'm curious, like, you know, did you get the same thing that I got out of being there, which was, I go from being someone who was interested in being a talking head and only thought about that side of things to then getting a behind the scenes look at like, wow, none of this exists unless we're playing the commercials that bring in the revenue and all of this stuff. Like, how much about the business side did you learn through that experience?
I mean, you got to see truly behind the scenes of how these pitches were born. Part of my task, my title in Winston-Salem was radio production manager. And that was my Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 job. It was nights and weekends when that shifted more to true on-air work for Georgia Tech, primarily working with West Durham, men's basketball, football, pre-half and post. But then I would do Wake baseball, Wake women's basketball play-by-play. But then there'd be conflicts. You'd have to step in and do a Villanova update and a Southern Miss, scoreboard update too. But as the company was growing, part of my job was, hey, we're trusting you that we're pitching another school. We're pitching, let's throw out Miami. We're throwing out University of Miami. We're trying to say, hey, Miami, we want you to come on board. Can you build something? And this was CDs at the time. Can you build a CD that we can play in front of a conference room to be like, this is going to be your sound? And then I had the creative, not just forget experience, but I had the possibilities and the freedom to, okay, how can I do this? So Carl Shannon was the legendary big voice. You were listening to the Georgia Tech ISP Sports Network. Well, he knew that what we were doing was confidential, but I would write him an email, hey, we're doing this. Can you record some billboards with the University of Miami? Then I would find on their website who's their biggest sponsor. All right. And I would just have them say maybe this sponsor. And then I would do snippets of other games with music and highlights and billboards and coaches shows. And I thought it was another way for, though I was never in the room when those pitches happened, but I felt like, hey, here's a chance for you to make an impact and see if this could fly. That this might win some people over and be like, okay, this is what I'm buying. If we come on board with you, this is what our broadcast could sound like. And when those landed, it wasn't just because of that, but it felt like I did something more than just say, hey, let's take a look at the out of town scoreboard brought to you by, Southern Miss Health. That was a way that I am showing that I understand the business side of it. and then the production side of it too, seeing how a broadcast is made, how a format is made, getting hands on with Adobe Audition, and we were using, carts, and we were using digital carts too. We'd have to highlight, we'd have to edit on the fly digital carts during the ACC tournament. It had to be fast turnaround because the ACC tournament, maybe you've had some guests talk about how ISP does that they bring everybody together. You're doing every single game. It was intense, hard work, long days, long nights, but man, those were fun. And you had to work quickly, think quickly, and come up with some good content. So it was not the highest paying gig, but it was something that you learned. This is better than attending any master's program. You're getting hands-on experience, and people are trusting you to come up with an idea and follow through on this idea that could make or break not just your salary, but many people's salary if they get new business. And for that reason, I really enjoyed learning the production side of things during those 8 to 5 hours.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think, I think it's important to not only be someone who's versatile enough to be able to offer that, but then also the byproduct for your career is that when you do quality work in that realm that helps out Ben Sutton or Chris Ferris so much, then all of a sudden you get great appreciation and you got a great relationship built with some pretty powerful people
Yeah,
and some pretty connected people in those situations. And as I was listening to you talk, it just sparked a memory out of left field for me of you got. I think you were there for a while until you ended up doing UAB football and basketball play-by-play for a year. Is that correct?
1 year.
Oh,
So I was, it made sense, and I think you've learned this firsthand that there was some sense into joining ISP when you did because jobs were going to open up, and you felt like if and when they do, they're going to look internally, one would hope first, and that happened. But Tulane opened up in 2004. I wasn't ready, nor did I get all that close to it. But then the following year, the Houston Cougar play-by-play job did open up, and I got very far with that. I interviewed with everybody. I went down to Houston, and I was the number two choice. I didn't get it, but I remember because Dave Brain was the longtime athletic director at Georgia Tech. He was at Virginia Tech actually, and then later at Georgia Tech. And we rarely saw each other face to face, but he would be on with Wes, and I would be getting a show ready, a weekly coaches show ready. And Dave would have a headset on, and we would, before we went live, we would just chat. And I'd chat with Wes, and I'd chat with Chan Gailey, the football coach, or Paul Hewitt, the basketball coach. And when Dave Brain was there, we chat. And so Dave was he wrote a nice letter of reference, a recommendation for me for Houston, which was very kind. But when I told him I didn't get the job, he said, "Don't beat yourself up about it," because his line was, "Before you could be number one, you have to be number two." And I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. And then the following year, the UAB job opened up, and I was lucky enough to get that, replacing Gary Sanders, who was the only voice that they ever had. So I thought, so the guy that hired me there actually was Watson Brown, who was not just the football coach, but the athletic director. And when I interviewed with him in the summer of 2006, he said to me, "Look, we're not asking you to sign a 20-year contract, but we don't want this job to be you're out in a year." I said, "Coach, this is really where I want to be. I really want to get going and be the voice of a school. I don't see the Cubs come knocking down my door anytime soon to offer me a job, so we're pretty good." And then 9 months later, it wasn't exactly that, but it wasn't too far off from that happening with WGN Radio.
well, there are always going to be those people who maybe yeah, I remember taking a newspaper job and kind of the same thing. Like I ended up having to go ahead and pivot out of that, and they weren't too happy about that. But you do have to do what you got to do. And the reason that I the reason that I had a memory flicker about that job was because I remember seeing the UAB job posted on the internet. And I was in my first couple years of my career, and I wanted to do play by play. And funny enough, you're talking about your Virginia Tech versus score situation. Well, I was in the exact same situation at that time. I was, well, a couple years beforehand, I was, I had two kind of possibilities at the same time. One was minor league baseball play by play, and one was sports updates on the Fan in Columbus, which is the Ohio State flagship. And it's not major market like yours, but it is a successful local radio station. And I wanted to take the baseball job, and the Fan could not guarantee that I was going to be the guy. So I went and took the baseball job until 5 days later, I realized I can't do like it's not like my student loans alone are more per month than what they're paying me, and they're not giving me the flexibility and freedom to go find other work. And so this isn't going to fly. And so, fortunately, the Fan came back and said, "Hey, how's baseball working out?" And I had to say, "Well, it didn't." And that ended up being the job that I ended up going to. But I remember seeing UAB in the midst of all that too, and throwing my name into that hat. And yet, like, I didn't get a sniff at it because here you were, an insider who'd been working the connections and ready to go. And so, it's funny the way everything works out, and all the no's that become so hard to take and demoralizing. They're all pointing you toward that one yes that you can't kind of see that coming.
And getting back to Chris, I mean, he was such a great resource to have during all this. The Tulane, the Houston job, and then UAB. And he gave me some great advice. And he told me that I always interviewed well, that if I could ever get to that point, and that I think is the hardest point. I think getting an interview at times it feels like is even tougher than it is to get the job because there's
Agreed.
if you get an interview for a job you're probably down to the final five, 3 to 5 out of applicants that are probably in the hundreds. So if you get to that point, which is not easy to get to, he said you're going to do fine. And little things that I learned along the way, advice, and something that I thought about: how can I separate myself from other candidates? Sorry about that. There's the ring camera.
Oh, good.
But there's how can I separate myself from other candidates? And I always went back to presentation because we're going to sound the same. I'm probably applying for the job that many of my friends from Syracuse are applying for, but what's going to be different about my CD, about my demo from theirs? And I remember when I was applying for the Houston job, I made my CD and I put a label on it that said, ISP Sports at the top. It was all not handwritten; it was all computer generated. ISP Sports. Then I would put the Houston logo on each side, and then I put my name and my number at the bottom of the label. And then so they would see it. It wasn't just handwritten. I took time with presentation. And then when I got to the interview, I didn't just describe to them, here's how I prepare for a game. I made broadcast boards. I made
Yeah.
spotting boards for basketball and for football. And that was advice I got from Tony Caridi, who voice of the West Virginia Mountaineers forever. I mean, he told me, he said, make a board. Show them this is what you do. You don't just kind of show up and be like, ah, here's the game. I showed them with their players, with the Houston quarterback, with the depth chart of the Houston basketball team. This is how I'm going to prepare to call your games with your players. And I thought this is probably different than the other 3 or 4 finalists, and that may make a difference.
Yeah. Pro move there. I think, yes, you got to, and there's no answer on from case to case to case. It's always going to be different. The one thing that's the same is going to be just having the creativity, maybe just taking 15 minutes to just close your eyes and get creative and think about how can I be different? How can I stand out? How can putting yourself in the shoes of people on the other end who are paper resume, paper resume, paper resume, all black and white, all same format, all Microsoft Word template, and then boom, color with big logos and like, something that looks a little bit different. Um, why have you put your finger on what it was about you that interviewed well? You said Chris said you interviewed well. What were you doing when you interviewed?
I think I think in terms of what I do and did well goes back to when I'm on the other side, when I'm asking the questions. I make it even to this day. I don't write things down. I think going into any interview you do, the listening is more important than the talking. You have an idea about how a coach's interview pregame is going to go. But if you're so locked in on this is how I want it to go, you're not paying attention to the answers because the answers may take you in a whole different direction than you planned. So I go into an interview with, yeah, they would ask you at the end, I knew would come up anything you want to ask us about the job. And at the time, I wasn't talking salary. I was more about asking about production freedom. How much freedom can I have to build a format, to shape it in a way that I would like to? And what it became at UAB was a combination of the Virginia Tech pregame show, the Wake Forest pregame show, the Georgia Tech pregame show, all these formats I got to be hands on with to an extent, but then pieces of, the Kroger Roth report that I loved how he would put that into his pregame show and the detail, the tight production that was in a Bill Roth pregame show stood out. To Wes Durham, little things he would pick up and he would point out in a broadcast where he would give the officials for a basketball game and not just their names but their hometowns. That's pretty cool. That's different. And then Stan Cotton would just drop in some great pop culture. He's a huge Seinfeld nut. I'm a big Seinfeld nut. So there were just some things that I really wanted to bring in. And that was something that I was curious about. You had something in the past. How much do you want it to sound like that? Or how much are you looking for this to be rebranded and sound differently? And more times than not, they wanted something new. And that's what I was hoping for.
One of the things you said earlier that did stand out to me was you said you'd be on a headset and you'd be chatting with ADs and coaches before they would take the air for their radio shows that were hosted by Bill Roth or Wes Durham or any of those folks. And I've been in that exact situation before, and I've been too shy to say anything. They didn't even know I was there. The only thing they heard from me was "Mike's up," right? And I always kind of felt like, well, they're doing their thing. They don't want to be bothered by me. But it sounds like you're saying that those little conversations had outsized impact in the way that you were able to use an AD as a reference for a job or something along those lines. They were able to actually remember you enough from some of those small interactions that it paid dividends. How have you approached some of those situations, and how do you make interpersonal connections and relationships, especially when you're kind of younger and maybe not quite at the peer level yet?
I mean, these people that I would only know by voice, I would eventually get FaceTime with at various events, namely the ACC tournament was the place that you would see them. And they're not always busy. I mean, there were times where Jim Weaver, the athletic director of Virginia Tech, was just, standing around, and Dave Brain was just maybe chatting with a writer, and I would just wait my turn and go over and shake his hand and finally introduce myself and get some FaceTime with this person that we have spoken with. Same with Paul Hewitt. Paul Hewitt was the Georgia Tech men's basketball coach, and the Georgia Tech football and men's basketball coaches show that ran during the day. And that was foreign to me because every other show that I was a part of ran at some restaurant at 7 o'clock on a Monday or Tuesday night. But here, this was on in Atlanta and throughout the network at like lunchtime. And it was different. And with that, I felt like it was more casual. And there were times when Chan Gailey was the head coach at Georgia Tech, I knew I wanted to tell him something because when he was the coach of the Dallas Cowboys, my cousin is Brad Sham, who's been calling the Cowboys for 50 years, my first cousin. So I wanted Chan to know that, hey, Brad Sham and I are related. And when I said to him one day in a commercial break, I said, Coach, sorry to interrupt you. I want to let you know that Brad Sham is my cousin. And I told him I was going to be with you today. And he says hello. He's like, my Brad Sham? I'm like, whoa, you're Brad Sham or my Brad Sham? We're blood. We're related. And so it became a fun little back and forth that started just innocently. And then it became, when I got a chance to see him in person, that was already there was already something there. A foundation had been built of some trust and some levity that we don't have to just talk about. Hey, what are you going to do with Calvin Johnson this week? How do you get him
Right.
open and get 10 catches for 150? It was more than X's and O's, and we just got to talk person to person. So I would look for my opportunities, but not push it. But when the situation came up, I would jump in.
Yeah. How's Brad doing? Is always that's a great conversation piece, right? Like, how's Brad
Yeah,
doing? I'm sure
yeah.
they
How's
would ask
Brad
that.
doing? And yeah, it comes up. It's amazing and I'm not surprised because the Dallas Cowboys are the Dallas Cowboys. But how many people know him?
Yeah.
And like, I love Brad Sham. And whenever I'm in Dallas for work, and I ask, an Uber driver, "Hey, you a Cowboy fan?" Of course, I'm a Cowboy fan. I'm like, "You like the radio guy?" He's like, "Oh my gosh, Brad Sham is my guy. Brad Sham is my guy." I'm like, "Oh, good." And then if they say I don't like Brad Sham, then I just change the channel. Then I move on to something else. But yeah, he's great. I mean, he was when I was in college, and you want to get honest feedback for your play-by-play. Mom and dad, they're going to give you all the good stuff. I wanted to know what works, what doesn't, and having him as my first mentor, my first resource to go to for tips, set me up. Without that relationship, without him, I'm not here.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask about your connection to him and just kind of how unique it was to have, because you'll see, you know, Noah Eagle is a fine announcer. He's very, very good. And yet, having a dad, or Joe Buck, as good as it gets, right? But having a dad sure helps. And for you to have the cousin, I wonder from what age you started to have the interest in doing this. And, I think a lot of us started from a very young age. I mean, I remember being 7 years old and my mom on a handheld camcorder recording a fake sportscast. But from a young age, being able to be like, hey, my cousin is gonna talk to me about what he's learning and what he's doing and how this whole thing works.
I mean, I was lucky when I grew up in Chicago when I did, just because of the time when I was a kid. The talented broadcasters, Hall of Famers in that market when I was a kid, were instrumental into how I grew up. My passion for the business really evolved because of that time. Jim Durham was calling the Bulls. Wayne Larrabee was calling the Bears on WGN. Harry Carey, Jack Brickhouse, Tom Brenneman, Pat Hughes eventually calling Cubs games. Hawk Harrelson doing the White Sox. Pat Foley calling the Blackhawks. I mean, these were amazing. Neil Funk was doing Bulls radio at the time too. Amazing announcers. And I was like, this is really cool. And I was the guy on Sundays. We got the Sun Times and the Tribune. And I can't recall which one it was, but one of the two papers on Bears Sundays would print the full 53-man rosters for both teams. And I remember cutting out the Bears are playing the Vikings, and I would cut out the Bears roster and the Vikings roster, and that'd be my board. I was probably 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever it was. And I would turn down the sound and I would call the game.
Wow.
And here I was. I was looking down. I mean, here's, McMahon hands it off to Peyton. Peyton gets a block from Galt. I'm just calling the Bears games. And this was me as a kid. And then it probably didn't hit me till I was maybe 12, 13 that, wait a minute, this is what I have family that does this. And then we went down to visit Brad for a game and to see my Aunt Harriet, Brad's parents, my Aunt Harriet, Uncle Jack. We went down to see them. And this is when the Cowboys were playing at Old Texas Stadium. So we got to see him in the booth. It was really cool. We got to run the field after the game. It felt like it was 10 miles because my little legs, it just took forever to get up and down that field. But we got to go we waited outside the locker room. We got to meet Herschel Walker, Ed Too Tall Jones, Jim Jeffcoat, Danny White. I'm like, you can be involved in sport, not play it, but still be around these guys and talk about it and make a living doing it. Yeah, I want to do that. And that's kind of where it really began for me.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that's fascinating about sportscasting is you can have a longer career in sports than any of the people you cover, right?
Marty Brenneman told me that. Marty Brenneman told me that. He said, listen, players come and go. Very few stay there for 18, 20 years, but you're going to be there for a long time. Remember that. The impact you can have on people is astounding. And getting back to Bill Roth, it was the perfect job for me at 21 years old to really learn about how to do this for a living and the impact you can have on someone's life. We went to lunch one day and he brought me a letter from a woman who recently lost her husband, who
Mm.
died of cancer in his 50s, 60s. And she wrote Bill this passionate handwritten letter. And in this letter, she's like, Bill, we've never met. I'm a widow. My husband recently passed away. He was such a big Virginia Tech fan. He loved the Hokies. He loved listening to you and Mike Burnup. It made his fall. And his dying wish was to be buried in head to toe Virginia Tech apparel. He had a Virginia Tech hat on, jacket, pants, and with that, a Walkman, a headset,
Wow.
and a Walkman that was tuned to the Hokies. I think it was 103.5, the Bear, probably, uh, in
Wow.
Blacksburg. And that when he read that to me and he showed it to me, I'm like, it's more than just look at what we do for a living. I mean, we get to go to these cathedrals and call a game, but think about the impact you're having on someone's life. Here's somebody I've never met. I mean, it's like, I'm not doing this to brag. I'm doing this to show you that if you stay somewhere and you really become part of the community, you're going to be remembered almost as much outside of a decorated Hall of Fame player as many of the guys you cover. You're a part of their lives. And I feel that now with the Twins because this is going to be my 14th season. That's a long time. And we're pushing on a decade, almost a decade and a half of calling Twins baseball. And the more I do it, the more I've been around, I start to feel that these people, many of them have grown up with me, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's incredible. I need to think about what the follow up is to that because that's pretty profound. Um, I think because I want to ask a little bit about your time with the Twins and you're now I believe you started out as the radio voice and you're making this you're I think you're done with the transition, but you're into TV now. And so I want to ask about that. But before we go there, one thing back to Brad Sham, the the era that you grew up in, because I think you're 4 years older than me, and like you know, I didn't have the chance to just catch any like I didn't have cable as a kid, and I didn't have the chance to catch any radio broadcast on the internet. So like I had that radio, but those AM 50,000 watt clear channel stations at night gave me the chance to kind of scan around and I could pick up KMOX or WGN or some of these other great radio stations east of the Mississippi that allowed me to hear the best in America doing what they did. I wonder, were you able to even hear Brad at all? Was he on a station that you were able to get if the night airwaves were hitting just right all the way up in Chicago?
I never did, and I really never thought about it. At that time, I never even thought about the idea, how can I listen to Brad? And it would just be, I'd hear him on a highlight. I would hear him on, maybe the score or WMVP 1000. Maybe they would play some highlights. Westwood One would play some highlights. That's when I would hear him. Or you know what it was? I know what it was now. It was we had cable, and it was Inside the NFL was on HBO at the time, and when they would show highlights, this was Nick Moinicati and Len Dawson and Chris Collinsworth. were on that show, and when they would show highlights from the week, they would use the hometown radio announcers, and that's when I just thought of it now. That's when I heard Brad the most. Was I would try to make sure that I could listen to. I'd find the Cowboy game. Now this is not, we're not recording anything. This wasn't DVR or TiVo, nothing like that. You just happen to see if it's on, and then you hope you didn't miss the Cowboys Giants game or the Cowboys Eagles game, because that's when I got to hear Brad. Would be during that show on, I think it aired on Sunday nights or maybe Monday nights, probably Monday or Tuesday after all the games were done. But that's when I got to hear clips of Brad Sham calling Cowboys football.
That's pretty cool. I'm sure now you can just tune them in anytime,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Which,
now I listen to him. Now I listen to him in the car all the time.
yeah,
I love it, and it was neat when they named the radio booth after him. It was when his mom, my aunt Harry, was still alive, and it was really neat. Seeing Jerry Jones kind of honor him, and Brad. I'm not sure if you've ever been to AT&T Stadium. So Brad's booth is in the corner. It's in the corner. It's up pretty good. So as Brad was kind of doing a tour of AT&T Stadium with Jerry Jones, he's kind of showing him. And so Brad asked Jerry, he's like, so where's my booth going to be? And Jerry's like, well, we're thinking about putting you over there in that corner. And Brad's like, really? But Jerry, we can't really see the game all that well. How about one of those mid-level, 40, 50-yard line spots? He said, Brad, I get about $20 million for those. So we're going to put you in the corner if that's okay. And so it was great. And look, the first game that Brad ever did at AT&T Stadium, he said, "All right, he's got a big crew of people. I mean, there was I think two producers, analysts, sideline. There's like 10 people in that booth. I've never seen a production like this for a radio broadcast." But he gave everybody that one. It was a preseason game. Everybody that one day, get all your gripes out, what you like, what you don't like, because after today, that's it. This is where we work. If you don't like it, don't come back next week. But he gave them one day, one game, complain, do what you want, but then next week it's over or don't come back. Pretty good. I like that.
I like that a lot too, and I might use that because everybody brings their life into the booth with them to some extent, but you choose from moment to moment what energy you're going to tap into. And I'm with you, man. There can be some energy vampires in the booth from time to time, and you don't want them around. And at the same token, if someone's coming in, doesn't matter how small their role is, if the energy they're bringing is super great, man, you want more of that, right? And that has been something that I've noticed in a big, big way. All right, let's talk Twins radio to Twins TV. What have you learned about yourself as a broadcaster? Just trying to do both.
So I'm a big podcast nut, and I'd say 20%, 15, yeah, about 15% of all the podcasts I listen to are about actually baseball. Or if I'm ingrained in college football, college basketball, then I'll shift a little bit. But 75, 80% of the podcasts that I listen to have nothing to do with the sport that I'm covering or about broadcasting. So one that I've stumbled into recently is called The Interview, now part of the New York Times. And David Marchese just interviewed Denzel Washington. And something that Denzel's on Broadway right now. He's on Broadway in Othello. And he was asked about the difference between theater and film. And what Denzel said resonated with me right away because I can make it somewhat applicable about the move that I made before the 2024 baseball season. But Denzel said is like with film, you're at the mercy of the director and the editor. You are going to perform, but what people are going to see really has nothing to do with you. Decisions are being made that you have no control over. Where it comes to theater, the everything goes up, the curtain goes up, you're on. It's you. And I think there's some truth to that with the move that I made professionally because TV is so much more collaborative. And it's not a bad thing. It's just what it is. You have got to be in sync with your producer and your director. in a way that if you're talking about the team and we're showing Carlos Correa on the screen, it's not the right time to talk about Byron Buxton. You want to make sure that you're in sync with your production crew. Otherwise, it's not going to look good. It's not going to sound good. So you may have to wait a pitch, a beat, and say, hey, because we have, and maybe your other guests have talked about, technically what you have in front of you from a broadcasting standpoint. You have a box, and there's two buttons on this box. One is a cough switch, which if you're going to sneeze, cough, you hit, and that mutes your microphone. Nobody hears it over the air. The other button is called the talkback button, and that again you push, and it's a direct comm line to your production truck, to your producer, to your director. Again, you don't hear that if you're watching the game at home. So instead of just speaking about Carlos Correa, I have an idea in my mind. Something came up. I will say, hey, talk back after this pitch. Can you get a shot of Carlos Correa? So that took me some time to realize. I'm like, don't have to get it in right away. Wait for it to look good, sound good. And then when that happens, then it looks like good TV. So you let the pitch go. Here's the 0-1. You don't have to even say, is it a ball? Is it a strike? Unless it was in play, everybody can see it's a visual medium. We see Carlos Correa, and then I might bring in one of my analysts, Justin. I was talking with Carlos, earlier today about a change he made with his glove, before the season, and we go on. But that to me is a better conversation if we see him. But if I am talking about Carlos Correa's glove and you see Byron Buxton, you see Royce Lewis, you see Joan Duran, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So getting back to what Denzel said was, I have to make sure that I'm in sync with what's being displayed on the screen. Whereas with radio, the curtain goes up, go. You want to talk about Byron Buxton? Go. You want to talk about Carlos Correa? Go. And to me, that made a lot of sense. It's a television broadcast is, and I mean this in a very complimentary way, it's an organized car crash. I mean, it's just you have all in your head for 3 hours, 2.5 hours, and then you have to kind of make sure that it's structured in a certain way, that it's going a certain way, but there's a lot of things happening, and things may happen that you planned for, and something else pops up, and you got to be ready to pivot and take that discussion, that segment, that moment into an entirely different direction than you planned.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, as someone that only does radio, I've kind of wondered a lot about TV, and I've wondered, like, you know, to your point, it is in a lot of ways it's my broadcast from the standpoint that, I mean, there's many that I'm the producer in addition to being the play-by-play announcer, right? And so um, I am thinking about, I don't have a stage manager even. Like, I got to make sure that I get all the live reads in. I got to make sure that our format is matched up with TV's format. And if it's not, and they're taking more timeouts than we are, that we're going to stay here. And here's how we're going to fill these 2.5 minutes. And like, I'm thinking like a producer while trying to also call the play by play. And when you are in TV, you have someone whose job it is to think like a producer. So does that free up your mental space to behave differently as a TV announcer, or are you or is your mental space going in other directions?
What I found challenging last year was, and I'm not one that, certainly for a radio game, because I've done it for a while, I didn't listen to myself very much. I almost am sheepish about it. I'm not comfortable listening to myself, but I did go back and watch games last year, especially early, and everything from the stand up, which anybody doing this will tell you is the worst part of their day. Nobody likes it. Nobody likes doing the stand up. Nobody, because the game, it should never be about us. It's about the players. It's about the coaches, the managers. Nobody likes doing it. It's the worst part of the day is the stand up, and you want to get that over with and get the game going. But I would go back and watch and like shoot. I could look at the camera more. I could look at my analyst a little bit more, Am I too jittery with my hands? Which I do. I talk, maybe you're seeing this on the Zoom call. I'm talking with my hands a lot. I am. Because I do that when I'm doing radio. I just happen to move my hands a lot. And it helps me kind of get words out too. That if I'm struggling with a certain description, that a visual cue will be something that my hands are doing. And it's something that I didn't expect would happen, but it's become almost something I do subconsciously where I'm struggling with what I want to say. And as I'm twirling my fingers like a traveling violation, that reminds me pause, breathe, instead of stammering. I would rather there be a breath, a pause, than here's the 0-2 to Buxton and a tie for ball one. The thing about Byron and how it's going to, you didn't need to say that. Just wait and pause. It's okay. Let it breathe for a beat or two. Find your thought, and then go with it. I don't think I answered your question here, but I'm just going here in a variety of ways. But I just one of the difficulties that I found last year, and it's simply because I was working with new people that I didn't know some of their visual and really their cues in my ear, where you see it on TV. You might, instead of going to commercial break, they might stay and they'll go to a two box. You see the game on your left and then a State Farm commercial on your right. I had no idea what my producer said. Hey, after an ordinary out, I forgot how he phrased it. He said, in game State Farm. And then I had it on my screen. There was like a digital screen that said what I was supposed to say. Now, this from State Farm. I didn't know what he was talking about because this was our second game, first game together. And so it's a routine out. And I'm like, Twins baseball is brought to you by State Farm. You know what? Now this from State Farm. Because in my ear, he's like, no, no, throw it to that. And then coming out of that, all right, I can have some fun with it or I can be embarrassed. And I'm like, come back live. And I'm like, that was smooth, Cory. Good job. Game two. Well, I thought, let's have some fun with it. It's okay. You don't have to be a robot. Let's have some fun with it. And so I found just some of that more challenging than the craft of doing TV play by play. Because I've done TV. I hadn't done much TV baseball, but I'd done it enough that I'm like, all right, I'll find my way. But just the ins and outs from a production standpoint, that was the part, making sure the sponsors are correct because they're different than they were on radio. Just making sure that that was buttoned up. That was probably more of my concern than anything else.
How are the producers pretty good about only talking and communicating to you while your partner is talking, or do you find yourself having to do what I just physically can't do, which is try to talk and listen at the same time?
No, you got to do that. I mean, TV, you have to do that. You have to be able to keep going while somebody's talking to you in your ear. You just have to, and that's something that you just learn and get better at and get more and more comfortable at and with the more you do it. But there were certain producers, yeah, that would just what I and I would do this in a very nice way. What I would tell producers like, tell me whatever you need to make sure that we're going in the right direction. But what I don't need are the one-liners. And there were sometimes producers would be like, I say something and it triggers some kind of pop culture reference, and they want in my ear, they're saying it, meaning like, hey, maybe I should say it. I'm like, I'm good. I don't need that. And there were times where a producer would, instead of just talking to our sideline reporter or just our analyst, he'd be on the all call button. And so we'd all hear it. I'm like, why do I need to hear something that you're just talking to another member of our team? Hit that button. I don't need to be on that. So yeah, but you just say so in a nice way. Be like, hey, can you lay off? And not during the game. It'd be, a call after the game or in a production meeting, a day or so later. Be like, hey, can you try and just back off the all calm call, during games, unless it's impactful, unless you have to do it because that would be distracting. Yeah.
Yeah. When you talked about nobody likes to stand up, yet at the same time, I feel like that's always one of the top things that people want to see in a reel is how do you handle your stand up?
Yeah.
One of the
Yeah. It is.
things I find super awkward is okay, I understand the idea that like I'm squaring up to the camera, looking in the camera, smiling. I'm giving my presentation while I'm talking. Then, as I bring in color analyst, what the heck do I do with myself while the analyst is talking and the camera is still looking directly at me? Do you look into the camera? Do you look at them? Do you kind of go back and forth? Do you kind of look down at your notes? Like what? Like talk me through your sort of philosophy and how you handle the stand up.
So Bart Fox, I was lucky enough to work with him. He is a great producer, and he was our lead football producer on Big Ten Network, um, going back to when I did BT football with that A 2023. And he was great with that. He'd offer me, that's the kind of feedback I wanted. And he would tell me, hey, with your open, he's a fan of when your analyst, and my analyst was Jake Butt, Mackey Award winner at Michigan, former tight end. He said, when you're on camera and Jake is talking, look at Jake. You look at Jake. But then my wife, watching back in Minneapolis, would be like, how come you don't look at the camera? I'm like, well, because my producer doesn't want me to. It really is subjective. Bart is so good at it. But when I do it now, yeah, and I like what Joe Davis does. I do. I think Joe Davis, he looks at Smoltz and he looks at his, whomever he's with, Greg Olson. But then he'll kind of look back at the camera just to remind people hi with that fake little smile that we all do. And Joe Buck does the same thing. We all do it. And it's something you have to do. But I do that now. And plus, I have thinning hair. And when I have my power alleys in the side, that when I'm turning to my left, it is like the golden arches of McDonald's, man. It looks, the off ramps are just too exposed that it gives just a little bit of more coverage when I do pivot back and face the camera a little bit and not showing everybody just forehead that's going towards the back of my scalp.
Power alleys. I haven't heard the term power alleys before. I like that though. That's pretty
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Hey Corey, this has been great. I'm looking forward to trying to catch you on MLB TV and all that stuff. But this has been awesome. I really appreciate the time, and I hope I get to cross your path again at another Big Ten venue, very very far from my house.
Well, I hope let's do it. Let's do it in Seattle, man. When the Twins come to town, it's my favorite city on the tour. If you haven't checked out Easy Street Records in West Seattle,
Mm.
highly recommend it. It's my favorite spot. Matt Vaughn is a huge baseball fan, the owner. I love Pearl Jam and that kind of music, so it's my favorite place in West Seattle. So I'll meet you there this summer.
All right, sounds great. Corey, thanks for the time.
Thanks, Tony.